So what I'm going to do in this section is I'm going to pose a question, and the questions are basically they're basically myths or common perceptions about clinical trials, and we're going to work together through some of these myths and debunk some of these myths. Aren't clinical trials just for people who have run out of options?
So it is true that I think, people that are designing the trials, clinical investigators, we are definitely motivated to provide trials for people that have run out of options. So you will see a large number, especially in the area of cancer, you'll see a large number of trials in the kind of second line where patients have, let's say, failed a prior therapy. So we do see a large number of these things because we're motivated to have options. I mean, that's true. But the answer is no. I mean, there's certainly a lot of trials out there available for people who have plenty of options, but are maybe interested in seeking an alternative option. Or the options that are available, it's not quite clear what's the right move to do. And so one good trial is to take two perfectly practiced options and compare them in a trial to find out which one is actually better for the patients.
Will I receive what's called a placebo, which many people would think of as a sugar pill or saline solution or something else that really doesn't do anything? Will I receive a placebo in a clinical trial?
So thanks, Rick, and that's a very important question, which puts patients in kind of a corner situation where they may feel that they have a cancer, they're dealing with a cancer situation, and then they are being offered a placebo or a sugar pill or a saline, which is technically not an effective drug for their cancer. And that happens in clinical trials, which are in very late stage of development, where we are looking for drugs which are or in disease setting where there is no standard of care, where we don't know if giving any treatment is of any benefit. And then we want to conduct a clinical trial looking at a new medication where the regulatory authority, which is FDA, may ask us to have a control arm where the patient is not receiving any treatment, since we don't have a standard of treatment in that stage or in disease setting, and or may ask us to offer patient placebo. Although more and more new trials are coming without having placebo, because we feel it is unethical to bring in a patient to give a saline infusion, whereas the other group is getting a real medication. But sometimes in combination clinical trials. So I'll give you an example. So there is a new medication like immune therapy. We know already chemotherapy works for bladder cancer, and we want to see if adding immune therapy to chemotherapy will improve the efficacy of chemotherapy. To test that kind of hypothesis, the clinical trial design will require us to have half of the patients receive chemotherapy only, and half of the patients will receive chemotherapy and the immune therapy combined with it. Now, to remove a bias of the treating physician who is deciding if the treatment is working or not, we may make the treating physician blind to the effects or to the drug which the patient is receiving. And how we do that is supply a bag to the investigator site and just label it as drug. And the treating physician may not know whether they are administering immune therapy or they are administering a placebo. And such an experiment, once it concludes, will give us a true picture of how many patients did really benefit from the immune therapy, and or if they had any additional toxicities due to immune therapy and not the placebo. And so there are certain designs, yes, where we need placebo. Again, that is more so in advanced stage trials, not in early phase trials like the trials which we showed you today. There is no placebo. Everybody is receiving treatment medication. And so it depends on the disease setting and the stage of development of the drug. I hope I answered that question.
Yep. And we're going to have the next question is a related question. Can I select the treatment I prefer from the choices being tested in the trial?
So this is a great question, and I think it's an important one that a lot of, not a lot, but some patients are kind of surprised when I explain that we can't choose a certain arm in the trial. So there are clinical studies where they're set up in such a way that the patient is allowed to choose. There's these certain trials, for example, where the choice of the patient is actually the meaningful endpoint and the meaningful data element that we're trying to collect. So we actually want to know what patients choose, and that's incorporated into the design of the study. So there are some interesting trial designs where that is allowed. In many trial designs in cancer research, we utilize something called randomization. And with randomization, patients are not allowed to choose, and doctors are not allowed to choose. And it's so important that the randomization be done in such a way as to limit any type of influence by the doctor or the patient onto which arm the patient is randomized to. And why do we take such efforts to do that? Well, generally, when we're looking at a clinical trial, we're trying to ask a question: is drug A better than drug B? And if the doctor, the treating clinician, or the patient have some reason for thinking that drug A may be better, or that there's some thought that this particular patient might be better served with drug A, then they may either consciously or unconsciously try to shuffle certain patients into one arm and different patients into another arm, and that's called bias. And the effect of that is that at the end of the study, and all these resources are put into it, if at the end of the study we won't be able to know whether drug A is better than drug B because we kind of selected certain patients for certain groups. So the gold standard is not only to have the selection of which arm the patient goes to be randomized, but also in some cases, as Dr. Singh was explaining, we blind the investigator. We may sometimes even blind the patient to which arm they're randomized to. So the bottom line is that it provides for unbiased separation of any preconceived notions of which arm would be better, unbiased distribution of patients across the study. And that ultimately gives us a better answer with using fewer resources and optimizing the efficiency of a clinical trial.
How do I find a clinical trial for me?
So in bladder cancer context, Beacon is the biggest resource. They list all clinical trials on their website, and they keep updating that. But in general, for any cancer patient, or for, in fact, any other disease setting, clinicaltrials.gov website offers you the most comprehensive resource of clinical trials which are open here in US and abroad. All you need to do is just put in the disease setting which you're looking for, and then you can click on trials which are recruiting right now, and you can then click on the trial and look for where the trial is open, and you can easily call the phone number listed on that page to find more about the trial and how you can be enrolled on that trial. But what I usually tell my patients is that if they are interested in some trials, they can go there, explore them, and then they can bring in what they want to, what they think is interesting to them, and I can help them decide what trial might be better for them to, if they are going to travel for that particular clinical trial. But obviously, each cancer center has a certain number of trials which are open. For example, at Mayo Clinic here in Arizona, in bladder cancer, we have 4 or 5 clinical trials open. We cannot open hundreds of trials because of the limiting resources, and also we have to assign resources to other tumor types. And so different centers will have different trials, and some trial may be better for you in your particular disease setting, and your physician can help you guide which trial might be appropriate.
My physician has not offered or did not offer a clinical trial. What should I do?
Well, so the first thing is that I want to assure you or reassure you that it doesn't necessarily mean that the clinician, what I want to make sure is that we shouldn't link the offering of clinical trials necessarily to whether or not you're getting good care or not. So there are some clinicians that may not be able to open a specific trial because they have competing other trials, or they may be in an environment which doesn't have the resources for them to open a specific trial. So that's one thing. You could start by just asking, your physician, are there any trials, call them back or talk to them there at that meeting. Are there any trials available for me? Do you have any open, or do you know where I might, find some? And if they don't have any open, and you find find an opportunity through the Beacon website, or you find an opportunity through clinicaltrials.gov, what's really nice about these sites is that they have contact people that you can actually they provide an email and oftentimes a phone number for you to email them, contact them, and ask them, is this trial currently available? I live in, South Texas. Where's the closest place that I could be enrolled in trial? So it does take a little bit of initiative from the patient's perspective to identify some of them when they're not open, but you can ask your physician, can you look and see if there's any trials available for someone like me? Can you make a recommendation of where I might could go? And look on the Beacon website as well.
Can I say no to or during a clinical trial?
This is a very important question in terms of rights of patients during clinical investigation. As a patient, you have full right to be on a trial since these trials are done through NCI-directed effort. Many of these clinical trials are done through NCI-directed effort and federal money involved, and you are a taxpayer. So you have right to explore these clinical trials and be on a trial. So as long as you meet eligibility, you can go on a clinical trial. But at the same time, you have the right to refuse a clinical trial. If your physician is asking you to be enrolled on a clinical trial and it doesn't meet your conscience, you feel that going on a trial is not something that you would like to be, you can always say no, and it should not hurt your relationship with your physician in any way or form. So much so that every clinical trial has a consent form which clearly describes that during the conduct of the clinical trial, including from the day one when you sign the consent form to even up to a year or whatsoever time you're on a trial, at any time point you can state that you wish not to be on that trial anymore, and you don't even have to give a reason for not being on a trial. And the physician and your relationship will or should not be impacted by that decision. We see that all the time on clinical trials where patients, due to professional needs, family needs, they have to move from one place to the other. And as I said before, clinical trials may not accept you moving out and going to a different center on a clinical investigation. And at that situation, you have to go off the trial. And so your right is most important. Either you want to go on a trial or come off the trial. And that can happen anytime and will not affect your relationship with your physician.
I don't live near a major city. Are there clinical trials for me?
Well, there may be. Certainly, one of the challenges with being enrolled in a clinical trial is the the key information that needs to be gathered is usually what happens after the treatment. So, for example, in bladder cancer, if we're studying a certain drug or a certain type of approach, then we want to follow the patients very closely to see if the tumor comes back, because we're hoping that it doesn't. And so that often requires repeated evaluations, as would be for standard of practice, but the repeated evaluations kind of need to be at the same site. Now, there are exceptions to that, and there are certain trials and situations where you could have your urologist that you're used to seeing perform the standard routine follow-up, and that could just be the results of which could be just mailed to the major site. So, a couple of options. One is there are lots of people that participate in trials that are not in a major city. They may be urologists or clinicians in a smaller city that are participating and have active practices with trials. So it's possible that you may have an opportunity right at home. B, there may be a possibility for commuting to a major city for the initial steps and then getting some of the subsequent stuff done nearby. C, you never really know what depending on the situation, how many visits the patient will require. So one important question to ask if you're considering going on a trial is, what is the follow-up period? What's going to be required of me afterward? How many visits are required? And are they standard visits, or are these actually new visits that I wouldn't have to do under the standard circumstances?
If I participate, what costs will I pay?
Again, a very important question with the cancer care, especially the rising costs and the insurance complicated scenario which is happening at the national level. This should be a very important part of the discussion which the patient needs to have with the treating physician. Usually, at the cancer centers who are offering clinical trials, they will have a person assigned who would review with your insurance the visits and the treatments which are a part of the clinical trial, if they are covered. And if they are not covered, then what would be the cost burden, or whatever copay would be to you, or if you go through the standard treatment on the clinical trial. And that is very important for you to know upfront, since you will be liable for that cost. Many insurance providers would refuse patients to go on a clinical trial because they may feel that certain tests which are being offered on the trial are not standard of care, and the research or the clinical trial should pay for that. In certain circumstances, if it's a pharmaceutical-driven trial or even an NCI-driven trial, there could be an extra test which the trial is asking, and they usually try to budget that in and pay the site for that test so that the patient doesn't incur. But unfortunately, many times the insurance providers may refuse or to accept the cost involved in the clinical trial, and that may come to the patient. And so it's very important that you should address that when you're signing consent. Before that, you should ask them to run the estimates with the insurance company and give you an idea of what it would be for you to be on a clinical trial.
Tell me about the additional research beyond the treatment portion of the trial.
So often, and especially nowadays, as technology is improving, there are often additional components of research embedded in a trial. So for example, we're conducting this current trial studying 2 different BCG strains. But embedded in that study, we're also asking a very important question is, we think that we have a biomarker that could distinguish responders from non-responders. We think that this biomarker will be able to help us identify patients who are unlikely to respond to BCG early on before waiting for the tumor to relapse. And so part of the benefit of this trial is that we're going to be able to validate this biomarker and potentially have this available for patients in practice. So there's a whole kind of other objective of trying to validate or develop biomarkers in the context of the trial. I wanted to get back to one other thing that I guess we haven't really touched upon that I want to make sure I say, because you know, one of my things is when patients are asking me about clinical trials, an often question is, well, what are the benefits to me? What are the potential benefits, and what are the risks? And I think that we should at least, acknowledge that the risks are very clear, that we don't know if this treatment may work. It is a trial, and so there could be some drugs that are not effective. There could also be some untoward effects or unpleasant, serious sometimes side effects of therapy that can happen with new agents. But there are a lot of benefits, and those benefits could be access to drugs that you normally wouldn't be available to patients. There is treatment that may be more effective than the standard approach. One of the kind of unappreciated benefit is the close observation and advice and medical care you receive, because you have a research team involved with your care. There's additional people checking your studies, checking your laboratory tests, reviewing your charts. So there are some definite benefits from that. And studies have shown that people that participate in clinical trials tend to have better outcomes for standard of care monitoring. And then, of course, there's certainly the chance to participate actively in the role of your own care through trial research, and the potential benefits in helping other patients afterward. So that's kind of the one thing that I just wanted to make sure I get across. And Rick, you have any other questions?
No. So I just want to let everybody know there is an article that I co-wrote with one of my counterparts at SWAG, which, remember, is one of the National Cancer Institute's virtual teams, and it was structured to speak to clinicians like Dr. Svatek and Dr. Singh, and talk about some things that are important in terms of designing clinical trials. So if anybody would like a copy of that, I can send it to you with no problem, because I'm an author. So happy to send that and share that.
For non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, what would be the optimal time to apply for a trial? This individual is a T1 high grade, currently having BCG plus interferon. If they want to join, should they wait till after their 3-month cysto, or should they do it now?
So essentially, from a patient's perspective, if the BCG and interferon therapy, which they have already received, if it works for you and your cancer is not seen in your bladder anymore, then you don't need any clinical trial. And all you need is maintenance therapy with the same strategy and follow-up. BCG is a very good medication, and that's why Dr. Svatek's trial is looking to explore more BCG options so that we can provide that therapy to patients, especially in situations of shortage. But then the clinical trial which we are conducting, which is looking at BCG unresponsive disease, then the patient has to receive full treatment, and then a repeat cystoscopy should confirm that the treatment is not working, and then they can go on to the clinical trial. But I hope that the medication which they are receiving will work for them, and they may not need the clinical trial, because you have to remember, as Dr. Svatek pointed out, the clinical trials, there's a risk that you are taking of side effect. Number two, what if the medicine doesn't work and the disease progressed to more muscle-invasive disease, and that disease setting may require more aggressive treatments with chemotherapy. And so this comes at a price, which the patient and the physician will have a discussion about risks and benefit. But at the same time, these are the clinical trials and hundreds and thousands of patients have gone on clinical trials. So now we have all these new treatment options. So your support is appreciated, but at the same time, that decision it has to be well-informed decision and a discussion between a patient and a physician for the right time to go on a trial.
I just wanted to add just a comment to that. So in terms of timing, I think you can never, it's never too soon or too early to discuss a trial. And so, for example, for Dr. Singh's trial, I've had several patients who've come to me that have, may or may not have had relapse of disease despite BCG. They're not quite eligible for that trial yet, but we at least have the opportunity to talk about the trial, to show them the consent form, to go over it, and so we have this. The earlier the better is the bottom line. The other thing I will say is you may not be eligible for any therapeutic trials right now, but there could be a biomarker trial, and there are some surveillance studies where basically trying to identify biomarkers that could help identify tumors that relapse that you may be eligible for right now, even though you don't necessarily need a therapeutic trial.
With the new molecular classification of bladder cancer, including neuronal subgroups being the most aggressive tumor with no response to chemotherapy treatment, could BCG help these patients in the future? Is it possible to imagine personalized medicine for bladder cancer treatment according to genomics for information of about the tumor? Are there trials that are being done in the non-muscle invasive space? Because that there are some being done in the muscle invasive or metastatic phase, but are there any trials being done specifically to non-muscle invasive and genomics?
So there are, and this is rapidly evolving, and this changes from year to year. We've learned so much about bladder cancer, and there's so much more exciting things that we learned. So for an example, there is a lot of evidence that FGFR3, a specific genetic mutation, is prevalent in bladder cancer, particularly in the non-muscle invasive bladder tumors. And there's a development of a drug that specifically targets FGFR3. And so a trial design that is currently either being implemented or soon to be implemented is identifying patients that have this specific mutation, superficial bladder cancer, non-muscle invasive, but they have an FGFR3 mutation, and then enrolling them in a trial of an FGFR3 agent. So that's an example, but there are others like that that are in the queue in terms of being developed.
But just to add a point to it, it's a excellent point regarding the neuronal type of bladder subtype, molecular subtype. And since you know about these subtypes, you probably also know that it's a rare entity and an aggressive type of bladder cancer. So most of these patients, they are found are in a little later stage, so T2 or muscle-invasive disease setting, where then they end up receiving chemotherapy. And since considering their rarity, it is difficult to conduct large-scale trials in that space because each hospital may see one patient or a provider may see one patient in a year. In a high-volume centers like MD Anderson or Mayo Clinic, we may end up seeing more, 5 or 10 patients a year. But again, clinical trials require a lot of patients. So we don't have a specific trial for neuronal subtype at this point in a non-muscle invasive disease setting. But then at the same time, there are many trials which are looking for bladder cancer treatment based on the genomic markers which are coming up. And as Dr. Svatek pointed to, the FGFR data was presented recently at ASCO GU also regarding the early results on FGFR and bladder cancer. And so definitely field is moving forward in a very promising direction.
I'd love to thank Rick Bangs, Dr. Robert Svatek, and Dr. Parminder Singh. Thank you so much. I'd like to also thank our sponsors once again, Merck, Genentech, and Insight. And just keep in mind that without clinical trials, there would be no new medicines because people want to be sure that they work before they're approved.